Jeff, welcome to the podcast. Such an honor to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Oh my, and I know I have not even read half of your bio. You are in sports, you've been in the law enforcement. So tell us a little bit about how you got into this field. Was it always your interest to get into the law enforcement area?
It actually was not. Had you told me when I was 18 years old that I was going to have a 33-year career in law enforcement, I would have told you crazy. And the story behind it is actually rather shocking and
Mhm.
probably um, not predictable. I was like you said, I was a college athlete. I was a Division I college ice hockey player. And while in school, I went out to a bar with one of my teammates. And when the bar closed, everybody was leaving. And my buddy thought it would be cute when he jumped up on the hood of a car that was full of a bunch of young ladies.
Oh,
And they didn't appreciate it. And when they sped up and then slammed off the brakes, he fell off the hood and he snapped the antenna to the car. And a police officer saw this. So the police officer came and grabbed my buddy, put him in handcuffs, put him in the back of the police car. So I thought, well, I need to find out where they're taking him, how long it's going to take before I can bail him out, and how much is it going to cost. And the police officer was just very belligerent with me.
hmm.
So he told me, get back up on the sidewalk or you're going to jail as well. And I did as he instructed. Well, he called in his reinforcements, and when they came over, they were again very belligerent and they used excessive force on me, which wasn't justified. And I ended up going to jail and my buddy didn't. And I was arrested for interfering in official business, resisting arrest. And I had to spend my entire summer's earnings with my defense. And ultimately, this thing was settled because I refused to take a plea deal. And I went all the way to a jury trial. And on that day, they said, if you're willing to sign this ticket for a $60 fine, then we'll drop all the charges. And that's how it was processed. And then you couldn't even write this. Then that exact same law enforcement agency was advertising for a correction officer position, which I applied for. And lo and behold, I got hired. I actually was working in the exact same jail that I sat in the night that I was arrested. So that's what it was, the treatment of the police that got me interested in taking criminal justice classes and having a desire to have a career in law enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, universe always has a different way of taking us where we need to be, and we don't even realize it. And yours is a perfect example of that. So, which was the first, like, how did you get into LAPD? Was that the first, like we said, Los Angeles Police Department, as we call it as LAPD? How did you get there? Was that the first one that you started with?
Well, to give you some context, I think it's important that everybody and your listeners understand my personal background. I was born to a teenage mother, and I was put up for adoption. I lived in a foster home when I was young, and then I was adopted. And I was adopted by my parents, who are wonderful, wonderful parents. And my father was a sociology professor at Kent State here in Ohio, and my mother was a chemist. And they adopted me because they wanted four children, each 1 year apart. And they were married 12 years at the time my mother got pregnant with my older sister, but they wanted to have us close in age. So they adopted me. Then they adopted my brother, who's Japanese. And then I had a African-American Black foster sister. And I grew up in the 60s and 70s in Kent, Ohio, with that diverse background as far as a family. So I saw things and that influenced how I view the world and the paradigm in which I see law enforcement through. So I actually didn't go out to LAPD with the intention of doing an entire career. I wanted to go back to school and get my PhD and be a professor of criminal justice. And my father discouraged me initially from doing that, saying, go to a large law enforcement agency, get about 5 years of practical experience. That will enhance your studies in your PhD program, and it'll make you a much more credible professor. And that's why I went out to the LAPD.
Oh, okay. So that's quite a journey, huh, Jeff?
Yeah.
So I know, yeah, and you really explained it so well. It is so heartening. Um, you've been in this industry, in this entire arena for a very long time, and you have worked on, like you said, you've seen it all, you've worked under pressure situations and everything. Two things. Number one is being in this area of work for such a long time, what has really made you the most happiest while being here, and what has made you the most saddest or disheartened you while in this law enforcement area?
Well, let's start with the stuff that I found the most frustrating.
Mhm.
And then we'll go to the better stuff. Um, I found that as a result of my background, I saw law enforcement as being very insular, and I felt that it lacked critical thinking and it was resistant to change, wherein there was no room for diversity and discussion. And everybody wanted to stay with the status quo
Mm.
when there were clearly identifiable issues that improvements could be made in. And I suggest that that is really what has hindered law enforcement in its evolution as society's expectation of law enforcement has changed. Actually, law enforcement in and of itself really hasn't. And that has been a very frustrating thing. And like I said, I intended on staying 5 years and going back to school and getting my PhD. I ended up staying a total of 33 years in law enforcement because of the fact of what I just told you.
Ah.
I wanted I saw myself as a potential change agent,
Mm.
somebody that could drive the mindset that needed to change in order to make the progress which is needed in law enforcement.
Mm.
As far as the things that I've found to be most rewarding and enjoyable, it's really about the interactions with the community. And although Los Angeles is a very violent community and city, and in that the vast majority of the people, regardless of what area you work, are wonderful people. And because of my background, the diverse background, I appreciated the diversity of the communities in which I worked. And I just found it fascinating. For instance, when I would work, I would go into the projects in South Central Los Angeles, and I would literally take off my gun belt, lock it in the trunk of my car, and I would throw the football around with the kids. And I would get a lot of, pushback from my colleagues and peers for doing that. Now, what are you doing that for? And that they'd already written them off. And I never saw it that way. I knew that they were probably going to have to cross a bridge one day. People didn't feel there were issues between the police department and the community in which we served. So many saw us as the enemy. And I wanted to try to bridge that gap. So one day when they're trying to be forced to be in a gang, they go, I remember that officer Wenninger. What a nice guy. He threw the football with us. He would buy me an ice cream from the ice cream truck. And if you just reach one child, then it's worth it. So that's what I found the most rewarding.
And I'll tell you, this reminds me when my children were small and growing up in North Carolina, that's where home is. And initially, they were very scared to even approach a police officer as soon as they would see it. And then through the school and everything, they learned that, the police is our friend and they are with us. And that's how when they really were able to interact, there were days when, the police officers would come, there would be some event or something, and they would speak, they would show them around. So I think that gap, like you said, I think now eventually it has started to change and it has started to bridge that gap. But you started that with your own.
Right. Well, I'll tell you, the one thing that used to always bother me is oftentimes a mother would be out with her children and they'd see a police officer and she'd point to us, said, "You better behave or that police officer's going to take you to jail." And I'm like, I never
Oh, that's
liked that.
bad.
I didn't want the children to perceive me
Yeah,
that way. I want
yeah,
them to
yeah,
perceive me as their friend. I'm there to help you. I'm a guardian. I'm a
absolutely.
guardian.
Yes,
I'm not a warrior that's looking to take you to jail. I am a guardian. And
correct.
so, and it's unfortunate. I see it to this day. I'm a volunteer crossing guard here
Mhm,
for the school in
mhm.
my small community. It's
Okay.
4,100 people.
Wow. Okay.
And the police department, they'll park across the street in the gas station and watch.
Uh-huh.
They won't come out and interact with the kids. What a lost opportunity.
Agreed.
Unbelievable lost opportunity. And that's the culture that I'm talking about in law enforcement, the them versus us. There's this
Yeah.
separation, this
Yeah.
arms that they have between the law enforcement agency and the community they serve. And it really needs to be bridged.
It does. It does. I see my both kids, of course, now they are grown, but while in school, while in even in high school, they started becoming friendly. They started to understand that police is here to help us, to guide us, just like you said. But I want to ask you, just while you were speaking about disheartening, I was noticing a picture behind which has your hand dug into your face dug into your palms. What is that about? Is that you?
That's actually me. It was taken, there was a photograph taken by Sam Taylor Wood. She's a world-renowned photographer, and she's actually was a director of 50 Shades of Grey and
Oh,
Nowhere
wow.
Boy.
Okay, yeah.
And she's a friend of mine, and she took a photograph. And then I had another friend of mine who actually is she's a retired police officer from the LAPD who identified her skill and talent as a painter. So she painted it. So that's
Wow.
actually a painting of a photograph of me.
But is
And
that a reason for the pose to be this way?
she was doing she was doing a project called Crying Men, where
Okay.
like Forrest Whitaker and Woody Harrelson and all these celebrities in Hollywood took part in it. And she asked me if I could cry. Well, I'm not an actor. I can't cry. And so I took a position that was consistent with distress or crying or what have you.
Nice,
And
nice.
actually that's going to be the cover of my book.
Oh, okay. Really nice. Very, very, really impressive. And that's where it just got my attention. So you have always worked in high pressure situations. Now you are even coming to the book, which I'll come to a little later. But how have you been managing these high pressure situations?
Well, I would say this is that officer wellness um, is very critical, yet it's often overlooked. And but it's critical for public safety. And it's not just about being physically fit.
Mhm.
Uh, it's about mental resilience. It's about emotional intelligence and the ability to manage the stress in which you're under every day as a law enforcement officer. And that being said, it's all about relationships. And I can tell you what worked for me. What I did for a living was law enforcement, but that's not what defined me. What defined me was who I am and what my values are and what I stand for and what my principles are. And I made sure that I had a diverse set of friends. Most had nothing to do with law enforcement. And what really worked for me was my father. My father, as I said, was a sociology professor, and I could talk to him about anything, all the hardships, all the stress, things I was trying to figure out that I was dealing with on the job. Because truth be told, most of law enforcement issues and concerns are sociologically based. And just when I thought I had things figured out in the conversations I'd have with him, he'd make me realize that I had just skimmed the surface. But he kept me grounded, and he helped me to be resilient to buying into this toxic culture of law enforcement.
What is the toxic culture when you said toxic culture?
The them versus us
Hmm.
mentality
Okay.
that and it starts with people get hired on the job with all the best intentions in the world. They want to serve, they want to protect, they want to help people. But then over time, they they get this mentality. It's law enforcement against everybody else, and then it's if you're not LAPD, then it's LAPD against everybody else, and then it's
Okay.
if you're 77th Division in LAPD, then it's
Yeah.
70 against everybody else, and it's just the wrong mindset to have. Yet you have to have an open, objective mind in order to be effective in law enforcement.
You've been in this place where you've been dealing with public, you've been dealing with criminals, you've just been there. What is the level of fear that you carry every single day about life?
When I was younger, I didn't have a fear of something happening to me. I didn't marry until later in life.
Mhm.
I'm 58 years old and I have a 13-year-old son. So I had him when I was 45. So all I had to do was worry about myself. And I've always, probably as a result of my athletic background and having competed as an elite athlete, I always worked very hard to be the maximum I could be at every competency level that I was required to have. And I demonstrated that when I graduated from the academy. I graduated as the honor recruit, the #1 recruit. Academically, I was #1. Physically, I was #2. And marksmanship, I was I'm sorry. I was #1 academically, number one physically, and #2 in marksmanship. And that just kind of is representative of how I am. So I never worried about something happening to me. I knew it was a reality, but by and large, I mean, this is the reality that in 2023, law enforcement is number 22 as the most dangerous job. It's only 22.
Oh.
Actually, crossing guards is number 12. And that's the number of people killed in that particular field per 100,000 that are in that field. So, everybody thinks that law enforcement is so dangerous. Garbage men die at a higher rate than police officers do. That's the reality. That's the reality.
Yeah, just like they say that the chances of you having a flight accident is less as compared to a road accident.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah, because it does look like a high pressure job. It does look like a job where you are constantly under threat for your life. And like you said that, you weren't married until, late, and then there was no fear except taking care of yourself and managing yourself. So, but like you said, fear is in everything. There are other jobs which we don't feel are, high pressure or dangerous, but they just happen to be. Now, coming to your book is being released. When is it releasing?
March 1st of next year.
So have you written in that anything about, and at least our audience would love to know, what are some of the trainings, how vigorous are the trainings you've gone through while in the police academy? Is that something we would read in the book?
You're training, what you'll read about the book, it's interesting. I've always said this: culture trumps training.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter what you're training people to do. If the culture is not consistent with that training, then you're making no headway. And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Los Angeles Police Department is far and above the leader in dealing with people of mental illness. Now, upwards of 36% of all officer-involved shootings involve somebody experiencing a mental health crisis. And although the LAPD has implemented all of this training, essentially, they're still statistically, that 1/3 of all shootings are still involving mentally critical incidents with mental health issues associated with them. So the reality is that the training is not making the impact that it should. And I would suggest that's because of the cultural mindset, that there's a mindset that, well, bad things happen to people that make bad decisions. But you have to be open-minded. You have to be self-aware. You have to understand that just your mere presence in uniform with multiple officers, you have to understand that it's going to impact the behavior of the suspect that you're trying to take into custody, who's having a mental health crisis. And you have to understand and have some insight into how pointing guns or shotguns or beanbag guns or tasers with the taser dart on the chest of the person, how that's going to potentially escalate the situation is counterproductive to an optimal outcome. So the problem is that the mindset needs to change, and it's the training that falls short because it's not being reinforced by the culture. Most of the training, unfortunately, I would say, it's the city doing their due diligence to say, we trained this particular person. But the reality is you're not going to be competent in it. So for instance, you go through the academy, and when you graduate, you have to show competency in defensive tactics. That would be the use of your baton and grappling and things like that. Well, after you graduate, we have what's called perishable skills training every 2 years. You may have a 4-hour block of instruction to refresh you on the grappling techniques. And I would suggest 95% of police officers do nothing other than that every 2-year, 4-hour block of instruction to maintain their competency. So they're not competent.
Yeah.
People truly overestimate the competency of police officers. It's unfortunate, but the reason it's like this is it costs a lot of money to train.
What would your book be about? Like you said, that's the picture which I see behind. That's going to be the cover page. But what's the book about?
Well, it's a book of 2 genres. It's a memoir because you have to understand my personal background, which I explained earlier, and my professional experiences. So you understand why I'm making the recommendations that I'm making for law enforcement to be successful moving forward in the 21st century. So it's a memoir and a prescriptive nonfiction for the solutions of how law enforcement can improve.
Looking forward to it, Jeff, to just read it. So what are some of your leadership lessons that you have learned from your experience all the way in law enforcement?
The reality is this, it's never about being right. It's about getting it right. And as a leader, what that requires is that you open yourself up to diverse opinions and you listen. And that requires that you have creative encounters.
Jeff, I want you to repeat that for our listeners, the starting line that you said. It's not
about being right. It's about getting it right.
So wonderful. So wonderful.
And I've always said that. And that means that you open yourself up and listen to the diverse opinions. And
absolutely,
it's very important, which requires that you have creative encounters where you want to, you promote diversity. You want diversity. You want difference in thought. And it's a problem is in law enforcement that that's decentralized. They don't want to hear what others have to say. But you need to listen internally as well as externally. Part of my frustration on the job was I was a forward thinker. I was a critical thinker, and I had all kinds of ideas, and I was shut down time and time again because it wasn't consistent with the status quo. And if all you're going to do is maintain the status quo, you're going to fall way behind. And so that's really what I learned during my time as a leader with the LAPD, that you have to be open-minded.
Very true. We have so many people who are into leadership positions. They are more concerned about being right than actually getting things done right. So I think that's such a huge difference, which you have pointed out wonderfully, Jeff. What would be your one piece of advice to our listeners who are wanting to become successful in their field of work?
Well, regardless what someone chooses to do, whatever endeavor that may be, the key is creating your own identity. And that's done best through being passionate, being courageous, and like I've said in my experience, always having a commitment of challenging the status quo.
True. And I think that requires you to be yourself. You were yourself. You are still yourself. You know what you want. You know where you're heading to. So I think that when you said you have to know who you are as an individual, that's only when you would know what you're most passionate about.
Exactly. The key to success is people have to know you. Yes. And then once they know you, then they can trust you.
And that takes time. It takes time to build who you are and for people to trust you, because like they say, it takes years to build that trust and reputation, but it takes only an incident to bring it down and pull you down. Right. So you're constantly aware.
Right. And the key to success is like I said, you're open to diverse thought.
Mhm.
But then you will ultimately, as a leader, have to make a decision.
Absolutely.
But you've been inclusive. And then what's key is that you provide an explanation of your rationale.
Mhm.
So those people that may not necessarily agree with your decision, they will appreciate and respect you because you listened to them and
Mhm.
made them part of the process. And then you provided them with the rationale and an explanation for why you made the specific decision that you made. And if you do that, you're going to be hitting home.
Influence. Yeah, definitely. You have them raving fans. They know exactly what they're heading to, and you don't have to be a leader who has followers. You're just influencing people to do it. Beautifully said, Jeff. So, thank you so much for being on this podcast, and you have been so kind enough to share all your insights and experience with us and our audience.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And this one's for our listeners. This is Jeff Weninger and Payal Nanjiani wishing you loads of success in your career life. God bless you.
Thank you.